The Silent Sisters of Bramble Hollow. There is a silence that is louder than any scream. It is the silence of three small coffins lying side by side in the morning frost. Coffins that held not the dead, but the living. The only sound in Bramble Hollow was the frantic scratching of fingernails against pine wood as the sun crept over the ridge, a sound accompanied by the scent of wood smoke and something else. Something deeply wrong drifting from the Ashbourne cabin. This is the story of Essie, Bessie, and Dessie Ashbourne, triplets born into the deep mountains of West Virginia in 1836, whose quietude would come to speak volumes more than any cry ever could. The Appalachian mountains have always kept their secrets close, nestled in hollows and along ridges where communities grew so isolated that bloodlines twisted and intertwined like ancient mountain laurel. Here, justice was not dictated by a courthouse, but by the unwritten laws of fear and tradition. Bramble Hollow was such a place, a scattering of perhaps 40 souls, connected by deer trails and a shared understanding that some matters were best left in the dark. The Ashbourne family lived at the settlement's heart, in a cabin that had sheltered 3 generations of folk who kept to their own business and expected the same in return. Mortimer Ashbourne worked the stubborn, rocky soil as his father had, coaxing a meager living from the land. His wife, Helena, came from good mountain stock, a woman known for her strength, her knowledge of old ballads said to soothe the mountain spirits, and her skill in curing a ham or birthing a calf. When Helena's time came on the longest night of that bitter winter in 1836, the midwife, Marcella Wesley, trekked through knee-deep snow, expecting 1 child, perhaps 2. No one was prepared for 3. The triplets arrived as the wind howled like a hungry beast around the cabin. Marcella would later confess that in her 40 years of midwifery, she had never delivered newborns who did not cry, not a whimper. Essie came first, then Bessie, then Dessie. 3 identical girls with dark hair and even darker eyes that seemed to stare out at the world with an unsettling, knowing intensity. "They watch everything," Marcella whispered to her husband that night, her hands still trembling, "like they're taking notes." The girls grew in perfect, unnerving synchronization, reaching every milestone on the same day, speaking their first words in unison, taking their first steps as if part of a carefully rehearsed dance. But where most children fill a home with noise and laughter, the Ashbourne triplets maintained an eerie quiet that settled over the cabin like a heavy fog. They communicated through glances and slight gestures, a private language that required no words. The neighbors noticed. Phineas Colebrook, whose land bordered the Ashbournes, mentioned seeing the 3 girls standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods, watching him work his fields with expressions that seemed far too old for their young faces. "It made my skin crawl," he admitted over supper, "like they were studying me for a purpose I wouldn't care to know." By the time they turned 7, the settlement's traveling preacher, Josiah Thornvale, found the children sitting in the front pew of the makeshift church, their hands folded, their unblinking eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his sermon catch in his throat. After the service, he pulled Mortimer aside. "Those girls of yours," Thornvale said, mopping sweat from his brow despite the chill. "They haven't blinked in an hour." Mortimer merely shrugged, the way mountain men do when questioned about family matters. "They're just quiet children, preacher. Ain't no law against that." But there were other, smaller signs that folks noticed yet never discussed, the way tight-knit communities handle uncomfortable truths. Animals began to vanish, first chickens, then larger livestock. Pets refused to go near the Ashbourne property. Children from neighboring families would develop sudden, brief fevers after playing near the triplets, fevers that left them changed, more cautious, as if they'd learned something they could not quite remember. The triplets themselves, however, remained untouched by common childhood ailments. They never caught the mountain fever, never scraped a knee, never seemed to feel the cold, even when frost painted the cabin windows. By their 15th year, their silence had evolved into something more deliberate, more purposeful. They had grown tall and lean, moving with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. They dressed identically, spoke in unison on the rare occasions they spoke at all, and shared a knowledge that excluded everyone else, including their own parents. Helena Ashbourne aged rapidly during these years, her hair graying, her hands developing a tremor. Mortimer took to drinking corn whiskey in quantities that concerned his neighbors, though none dared comment. The couple had tried for more children after the triplets, but Helena suffered 3 miscarriages in succession, each loss leaving her more hollow-eyed and withdrawn. The mountain itself seemed to respond to the girl's presence. Gardens near the Ashbourne property produced stunted, ashen-tasting vegetables. Wells that had run clear for generations yielded water with a metallic tang that the livestock refused to drink. The old-timers muttered about curses and mountain spirits, but this was 1854. Such talk belonged to a superstitious past. Surely 3 girls could not be responsible for the hollow's growing unease. What happens when silence becomes a weapon and 3 sisters decide that 18 years of watching is enough? The answer would arrive with the harvest moon, when Bramble Hollow learned that some hungers can only be satisfied by the taste of betrayal, and that blood runs thickest when it is spilled by family hands. But before we witness how the Ashbourne triplets earned their place in the darkest corners of Appalachian folklore, consider the weight of such a silence, and what it might be hiding in the shadows of your own world. If this tale of mountain secrets has caught your attention, the true horror is only beginning to unfold. The morning Phineas Colebrook found his prize bull, Caesar, with its throat opened in a perfect, precise line, the air itself tasted of copper. The massive animal had been drained of blood so completely that the grass beneath the carcass remained green. This was no animal attack. It was butcher's work, yet no tracks marred the frosty ground around the body. This event on October 15, 1853, just weeks after the triplets' 17th birthday, marked the beginning of Bramble Hollow's descent into a darkness that would reshape the very meaning of evil for the mountain folk. The death of an animal meant for breeding and survival sent ripples of tangible fear through the settlement. 2 days later, the widow Morrison's chickens were found arranged in a perfect circle in her yard, each bird drained of life, their eyes clouded white. She packed her belongings and left for the valley that very afternoon. "Something's stirring in these mountains," she warned. "Something that's been sleeping too long." The Ashbourne triplets attended the bull's hasty burial, standing at the edge of the gathering, identical and silent. Preacher Thornvale caught Essie smiling, a brief, cold upturn of lips that held no warmth, only a stark satisfaction. That evening, a strange melody drifted from the Ashbourne cabin, a harmony of 3 voices that seeped into the very bones of the listeners, a tune that made the trees creak and the night birds fall silent. Dr. Edmund Fairfax, a traveling physician, arrived to find a community gripped by a fear it could not name. Patients described dreams of 3 figures standing at their bedsides. Children suffered night terrors, screaming of the sisters who don't blink. His rational explanations began to crumble when he was summoned to examine Phineas's youngest daughter, Martha, who had vanished for 2 days and returned changed. She spoke in fragments about the sisters and the teaching, and on her left shoulder were 3 small, interlocking circles, carved into her flesh with surgical precision, marks that mirrored the birthmarks on the Ashbourne triplets. Martha Colebrook had been claimed, and if one child could be taken, others would surely follow. As November's chill settled over the hollow, the situation escalated. The marked children began to gather at the tree line each evening, moving in a silent, synchronized manner that was profoundly unnatural. They were an army in the making, and their generals were about to come of age. The true test for Bramble Hollow was not if they could fight back, but if they could fight at all when the enemy wore the faces of their own children.